You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 30th of May, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Brazil becomes the latest country to call its ambassador home from Israel. Another once great local newspaper circles the drain. And which corny tourist gimmicks will we admit to quite enjoying? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Nadine Batchelor-Hunt and David Brennan will discuss the day's big stories, and our weekly letter from is a letter from Djibouti, or at least from the airport in Djibouti. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, political reporter for Politics Home, and by David Brennan, diplomatic correspondent for Newsweek. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
David, we will start with you because it is your first time on the Daily, as regular listeners will already have anticipated. We have made you dress up in the owl suit, but everybody has to go through that. From inside the owl suit, however, if you could explain just briefly who you are, how you got here, how you arrived at this, doubtless the pinnacle of your time in journalism.
Yes, I can pack it in now, I think. But so I've been at Newsweek as their diplomatic correspondent for a little while, reporting here in London on kind of the world's most sort of disturbing and unpleasant conflicts, I suppose, and the various talks around them. So it's nice to have a break here in this lovely studio.
Nadine, you are familiar to our listeners by now. As people will know, you are actually a British politics reporter. We are now towards the end of week one of this general election campaign. Do you think you have another 5 in you?
I do, and I think there's so much to see from Ed Davey and all the water sports he's getting up to. I mean, there's the paddle boards.
He's having a great time, isn't he? This is. This is Ed Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrats, who just seems to be using this election campaign as an excuse to get free tickets to sideshow attractions.
Absolutely. I mean, there was the launch where he fell off a paddleboard 4 times in Lake Windermere, which is apparently full of sewage. Mm-hmm. But he survived. And then today he was going down a massive water slide. Although somebody said there's a real chance now that he could get pneumonia before the end of the election campaign if he continues in all these dirty water activities.
He could be the William Henry Harrison of British politics. One for the US politics heads there. Nadine, just before we move off this, you have also been eyeball to eyeball with the likely next Prime Minister.
Yes, I was out with Keir Starmer yesterday. He had a visit in Worcester, and I asked him about whether or not Labour would work with the just defeated former mayor now, West Midlands Mayor Andy Street, and he didn't rule that out, which was interesting. But no, he's definitely got better at communicating and has extremely intense eye contact when asking a question, so there's that.
OK, well, we will start with the continuing, indeed accelerating diplomatic repercussions of Israel's ongoing assault on Gaza. Now nearing the end of its 8th month, the total of dead, injured and missing reckoned by Hamas authorities at over 100,000 people. Brazil has become the latest country to downgrade or break off diplomatic relations with Israel. It has recalled its ambassador from Tel Aviv. Other Latin American countries to have made similar gestures include Belize, Bolivia and Colombia. Elsewhere in recent weeks, a few European countries which had not previously recognised Palestine, Spain, Ireland and Norway, now have. David, first of all, diplomatic editor that you are, diplomatic correspondent that you are, elaborate to our listeners the withdrawal of an ambassador. It's not actually a severing of diplomatic relations. The Brazilian embassy in Israel is still there and still functioning. So how big a whoop actually is that?
I suppose in the diplomatic sphere, it's a pretty big whoop. I think for normal people, it's maybe not so big a whoop.
It's definitely a step up from a mere summoning, isn't it?
It's a step up from a summoning, but it's a step down from a severing. Should we say that? This is part of a kind of larger spat that's been running since February, I believe, when Lula compared what's happening in Gaza to the Holocaust, which understandably the Israelis didn't take so well. So this is the latest in a kind of back and forth, tit for tat, summoning humiliation of ambassadors, telling them off in public. It can be a hard job being an ambassador. When things are going well, it's all dinner parties and nice events and photo shoots. But when things are going badly, you are kind of a bit of a punch bag. You're there to soak up the anger, the frustration. So I suppose that's what's happening with them right now. We shouldn't be surprised, of course, that South American nations are taking such steps. They've long been pretty sceptical of, shall we say, sceptical to be generous, of Israeli conduct. But it's still it's a drip on this wider journey towards diplomatic isolation for the Israelis, which they are clearly feeling. Every time something like this happens, the reactions are pretty furious. There is clearly concern there. But to go back to the original question, not too big a whoop.
Nadine, the Israelis are clearly feeling it, as David says, but they're not actually doing all that much different in response. Indeed, the more condemned they are and the more disquiet even their most robust allies express, the more determined Israel seems to plough on to wherever it is it thinks it's going.
Yeah, I think this is because this is as much about Israel as it is about Benjamin Netanyahu's survival as Prime Minister. He is at the behest of the more extreme elements in his government, and if he really doesn't do what they want, then they can collapse his government and force an election, which he doesn't want. So this is the kind of undercurrent for all of this, is the internal Israeli politics is playing out on an international scale. But there is that fear of, for Israel, of diplomatic isolation, and they are going down a path which just seems to get worse and more unfathomable each day in Gaza. The scenes we saw in Rafah over the weekend were just horrific. But again, we are dealing with a very extreme Israeli government that has a very extreme view on foreign policy, and it's playing out in real time. And I just wonder what Israel is going to have done to its international relations in the years and decades to come, and its reputation. I mean, I'm not saying Israel had a great reputation anyway, but where it's at now is at rock bottom. I've genuinely never seen so much contempt for Israel before. So yeah, it's a really dangerous road they're treading. But again, it's also about Netanyahu's survival. He doesn't want his government to collapse. He wants to continue being Prime Minister, and it clearly seems to be he'll do whatever it takes to continue.
David, I think Nadine does make an important point there, that this is all very much occurring in the head of Benjamin Netanyahu to a certain extent. He is, this is a corner into which he has painted himself, but he is entirely at the mercy of a coalition largely comprised of some extremely odd people. That borne in mind, and we do understand that Netanyahu won't be Prime Minister forever, even if he might wish to be. Once there is a change of government in Israel, do you think that the diplomatic odium they have accrued in recent months will last? Will countries understand, OK, it was Netanyahu, not Israel, and be willing to return to business as usual?
This war, for all of its controversies and all of the horror that we've seen, remains relatively popular in Israel. The ambition behind it to quote unquote eradicate Hamas remains popular. Support for the two-state solution among Israeli voters, depending on which poll you look at, is either at historic lows or just at lows, but it's certainly low. So this is bigger than Netanyahu, and Nadine is right. This is part of the Netanyahu, psychodrama that we're seeing. We've written him off many times before. Who knows what the election, when it does come, will bring. The likely opponents who will be looking to take over from him, two of whom are in the war cabinet, Yoav Gallant, who may yet be subject to an ICC arrest warrant, and Benny Gantz as well. And, these guys are part of this too. Netanyahu is, of course, a veteran leader, incredible contacts. He's an excellent operator. His relationships in the US are incredibly strong. Whoever replaces him will not have that kind of political capital that he has built up. So they may be more under pressure to give some more consideration to international criticism, but they're not going to immediately pivot from this path.
Nadine, just before we move off this and we look at the other track of diplomatic realignment, which is these countries And to be clear, most countries already did recognise Palestine as a state even before this started. About 3/4 of the UN already did. But since October, we've seen Barbados, Jamaica, Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago and those 3 European countries join the list of countries which recognise Palestine. For all the perhaps understandable reluctance there is to countenance the idea among Israelis at the moment, do you feel like there is renewed momentum behind a Palestinian state and a two-state solution? Because if we're trying to be optimistic about this, and I realise that's a bit of a reach in the current circumstances, if Israel does succeed in its narrow aim of dismantling Hamas, that does appear to remove one considerable obstacle to a two-state solution.
It's a really bizarre situation because Netanyahu is on the record saying he doesn't want to see a Palestinian state, and therefore, if you don't want a Palestinian state, then what are you saying?
But he does
finish that sentence properly.
But for reasons you explained earlier, he does kind of have to say that, doesn't he? Or the Yahoos will do for him.
Yeah, but it just goes to demonstrate that kind of even though that seems to be what you would imagine he would want, he's saying that he doesn't want that. And then obviously the recognition of Palestine by increasingly, more Western countries is significant. Whether or not that means there's growing support for a two-state solution, I mean, I've never seen more unhappiness, online, obviously, the internet isn't real life, but more unhappiness with the state of Israel's existence online than I have at the moment. So whether or not that translates to support for an Israeli state and a Palestinian state, I don't know. I'm not sure if people are thinking on those. Everyone has become extremely polarised on the matter. It seems you're either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, and you can't be both. But I definitely think that for Palestinian recognition, it has been significant, and I don't think this was the intended side effect of this war for Israel. Although everyone else watching it, international observers probably could have predicted that actually you're gonna commit some what looks like a lot of war crimes, and you're going to increase sympathy for the Palestinian cause and probably increase momentum for greater recognition of Palestine. I don't think Israel thought that would happen. I think they thought it would probably weaken any prospect of a future Palestinian state, and that doesn't seem to be happening. I mean, their argument is, if you start recognising Palestine after what Hamas has done, then you'll legitimise terrorism. And then others will say, well, actually, the fact that Palestinians have been left so helpless demonstrates the need for them to have a state and the need for them to have proper diplomatic relations with other countries. So it's a mess, basically, as I feel like I always end up saying with Israel-Palestine. But I do think, Palestinian statehood has become much more on the agenda than it was this time last year.
Well, now, once again, we tempt the fates by discussing the matter of the people of the state of New York versus Donald J. Trump. As of this broadcast, he said, crossing his fingers, the jury is still deliberating, and if they are going to return a verdict today, we would greatly appreciate it if they could give it a few more hours yet so people have time to listen to this episode. In the meantime, we will examine a subplot of the case, i.e. the possibility that this or one of Trump's other trials might end up in front of a US Supreme Court which appears increasingly compromised, and not even by Trump's own appointees. Justice Clarence Thomas's wife is a 2020 election denier. Justice Samuel Alito's wife, by all appearances, ditto. David, the Alito controversy is the more recent one. This appears to pertain to a disagreement with their neighbours, after which Mrs. Alito hung up a couple of flags, in fact, which generally are understood to display sympathy with the January 6th headbangers.
Right. It's, I suppose this is the kind of neighbourhood dispute that you would have, but you are the wife of a Supreme Court justice, so everything's a bit more under the microscope. But the details of it are, I mean, if it wasn't so consequential, it is quite funny anyway, let's be honest.
It is quite funny.
There are the reports of, chasing cars down the street, spitting on car windows.
It's all terrifically grown up.
It's very juvenile, but I suppose that's suitable for where we are right now with the political situation in the US. Maybe this is the new normal.
The question that is being asked, Nadine, is should either or both of these judges recuse themselves from any matters pertaining to Donald Trump?
It's America, so I don't think that they will. even if you've reached a conclusion where you think potentially they could be biased. America is just kind of so wild. The fact that the 6th of January even happened, I just can't see them stepping down in any way or being. I imagine they'll say I've got my rights, so I'm American. I've got freedom of speech. I can imagine it now. We've seen all the tropes on TV. So no, I don't think it will be that consequential. I think there'll be a lot of more from the more critical side, the media that's more critical to Donald Trump, you'll probably see a lot of commentary on why they should step down. But I don't think they'll recuse themselves.
I mean, it is quite a weird setup. And David, I do realise that most countries' setups are really quite weird when you start pulling them apart. But the US Supreme Court, to remind our listeners, it is a lifetime appointment. Once you're on the bench, they can't get you off necessarily until you're carried off it in a box. And the recusal thing can be done, but it's an honour system. It's entirely up to the justices involved. And if they decide, no, by golly, I'm going to sit here on this bench and judge this case, there is nobody that can stop them from doing it.
It can be done. They can recuse themselves. I did have a quick look into this because I wasn't sure about the history of recusals. So Justice Alito did recuse himself from an appeal involving a company in which he owned between $15,000 and $50,000 in stock. So that, I guess, is his threshold for recusal. I don't know where January the 6th insurrection sits compared to that, but I mean, it's maybe I'm projecting, but if I was a Supreme Court justice and there was something as consequential up for debate as presidential powers and insurrectionary activities, I'm not sure I'd want to be left out of that.
I think also the Supreme Court in America is so inherently political in terms of the leanings of the judges. Like, you want a Democratic kind of leaning judge or you want a Republican judge. I think Biden today was talking about how the next president is going to probably be appointing a few justices. So it's so politicised anyway. It's kind of pretending that pretend that those biases don't exist as it is. So, yeah, I think the American legal system, I mean, there are shortcomings here as well, but I do find it quite unusual that judges can have those affiliations so openly and still serve on a Supreme Court.
So what I wonder is if we are running up against a certain naivety, if you like, of the founding fathers and or the drafters of the Constitution, in much the same way as you correctly reminded us earlier, Nadine, there is absolutely no bar on running for president or indeed being president while an inmate of a federal penitentiary. As has been discussed on this programme before, Eugene Debs polled nearly 1 million votes as the socialist candidate in 1920 while in the clink in Atlanta on sedition charges. But I do wonder, once again, the Founding Fathers don't seem to have considered the possibility that the citizens of the United States would knowingly elect a convicted felon president. So they don't seem to have got their heads around the idea that Supreme Court justices might be anything other than these sort of unimpeachable creatures.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, there is, I feel like in America, there is a lot of criticism of the establishment. There's also kind of a lot of reverence for the establishment. And it does kind of feel that this will just be kind of accepted. And I also think that whatever goes on with Trump, I think if he gets a criminal conviction, very unlikely he'll go to jail from this hush money case. But I do think it will just galvanise his base. I think that they will see it as, president under attack. Some of the most entertaining tweets that Trump used to put out was just presidential harassment in capital letters with an exclamation mark. But that, in many ways, gets to the heart of the mindset of both him, who is the main character. In his mind, he's the main character in everyone's lives, not just his own, but also his followers. They relish, they kind of almost like feed on this kind of self-imposed victimhood that Trump puts on himself. When he faces consequences for his actions, it just feeds them. So I think this will just make his base stronger. The kind of floating voters who may be a bit disillusioned with Biden and maybe thought maybe we could try Trump again might be put off a bit by it, but I think it'll probably just entrench people's views more than anything.
David, there's a general ethical question on this one as well, just before we move on to other things, which is, and you can see that Alito is trying to spin this line, that you can't really hold somebody responsible for the behaviour of their spouse. Their spouse is obviously an individual with agency who is allowed to express themselves, surely to goodness. Does that stand up? Do we in fact get into a bit of a weird area if we start telling people they should stand down from their jobs because of something their spouse or partner did?
Well, I'm not going to go toe-to-toe with Alito on any legal questions. I think I'd lose that. But I do think that the fact that we have, these two spouses involved in these controversial activities, shall we say, is maybe concerning because they are part of a conservative political elite and establishment in the US in which they are not anomalous, in which their views are not unusual. So we may be horrified that, Ginny Thomas has these purported connections to insurrectionists, but that won't be unusual in the kind of conservative elite circles in which she swims, in which her husband swims, in which the other conservative justices do swim. So this is a pretty troubling soup that they're all bobbing around in, and I don't really have any good solutions to how to solve that.
Outstanding extended metaphor, though.
Struggling there.
Here in London, bad news for journalists, good news for tube train cleaners. The Evening Standard, London's local newspaper since 1827, is to abandon its daily print edition in favour of a weekly edition. Management have blamed a drop-off in post-pandemic commuting and the increasing rollout of Wi-Fi and phone signal on the Underground. It is nevertheless the case that the Standard has reported losses for 6 years running now. The paper became a free sheet in 2009, but piles of unread standards have become a melancholy fixture of tube stations. Fun fact, dredged from the reminiscences of former employees, in the days before football reporters could phone the scores in, they dispatched the results by carrier pigeon. The Standard's old building had a loft in the roof. This is going to be one of those things where we see if 3 journalists are interested in discussing the state of the media for several minutes. Do you reckon we can do it? I'm confident. Nadine, just as a benchmark, because this thought occurred to me while we were researching this story earlier, I don't think I can remember the last time I saw anybody on the tube, which I do catch at least twice a day, actually reading it.
No, I think people read the Metro, which is the one that comes out in the morning. I see people pick that up. But the Evening Standard, I think, really has kind of declined in terms of when you see people reading it. And I think it is sad, but I also think it's kind of the inevitable, direction of travel. I mean, people my age, I don't know any of my friends that buy newspapers or get their news from newspapers, and even if it's free.
People of my age can remember buying the Evening Standard. Yeah,
well, this is the thing. It would be very unusual to kind of go around to my friend's house and them to be there like with a big Sunday Times or something. You'd be like, what? You get it on your phone maybe, like a Times subscription maybe. But so I think it is this kind of shift in a generational shift where people do just prefer to get their news online. It's more convenient. I mean, it's kind of alarming how much we do on our phones, like shopping, reading the news, talking to loved ones, etc. But I think it is the direction of travel for journalism, and I think it's something that is going to become more common. And I do think there are some publications that have managed to kind of get the transition right. The Times is having quite a successful subscription service, the Financial Times as well. But I do think that, things like the Evening Standard are struggling. Why the Metro isn't as much? I mean, maybe it is, I'm not sure. But the Metro seems to be doing okay. Maybe it's the type of journalism, bit more relaxed, bit easy to read. But yeah, it does feel like a bit of the end of an era.
David, is it, and I don't wish to sound at all like I am taking any pleasure in the demise of a print publication, because I don't and I haven't and I wouldn't, but is there an argument that beyond what the management are saying about the sort of, I guess, broader issues like the fact that it's easy to use your phone on the Underground, that there are less people commuting, that the Evening Standard in recent years especially just has not been very good?
I think so. I also had a joke written down there about the cleaners on TfL, so I'm glad we're on the same page. That one very much intended. No, I do think there is a case for that. If you look at the figures that the management is referring to, it's not been a rosy picture for a very long time, if ever, for the Evening Standard, and that predates the pandemic, as far as I know. It may be that it's a stale model that was never really going to work. I mean, as you said, you people of your age remember buying it. I vaguely even remember buying it from growing up in London. But I suppose maybe it was a long-term gamble that maybe didn't pay off so well. And we'll see. Hopefully it will survive in its weekly format. Unfortunately, it sounds like there'll be some restructuring, so possibly more journalists losing their jobs, which of course is a shame as well. I'm sure we all know people who work
Absolutely.
or have worked there, and every paper that closes, every restructuring that happens, there are fewer opportunities for journalists to join the industry, to upskill and to practice their writing. So yeah, it's obviously, I would say this as a journalist, but it's sad.
It is, but Nadine, it is the demise, near demise of yet another local newspaper. In the UK alone, since 2009, that's just in the last 15 years, 300 local newspapers have closed. And I know that there's one big reason for that, which is that there is no classified advertising for local newspapers or print paper anymore, or at least none to speak of. But is it maybe also the case that people are actually weirdly uninterested in reading about local news, that people don't want to read about what their council is arguing about? They don't necessarily want to read stories about potholes not being filled in, that they're simply not all that interested.
Yeah, I do think that the attention economy is a real thing. I think there's much more things to be keeping people's attention these days, like social media. Social media, it takes up a lot of people's free time, the time that they may have otherwise, picked up a newspaper and read it or checked out what's going on in their local area. They may now scroll on Facebook and be able to see what's going on with their friends, etc. And there are a limited amount of hours in the day, and when people are spending big chunks of their time, I mean, I don't use TikTok, but I know I've got friends that do, and they spend hours on that stuff. So if you're spending that amount of time on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, you have got less time to be spending on your local news, on your local newspapers, to care about what's going on near you. So I think it is just a sign of the times as everything goes online. But I do think the demise of local journalism is extremely sad, because so many amazing stories come out of local journalism from like local rights campaigns when it comes to things like justice and fairness with local councils, to just like amazing stories of day-to-day adversity. So it is really sad to see the decline of local titles, but I do think it's an inevitability, and the industry needs to kind of learn to adjust however it can.
And now to the latest wheeze from a well-known ride-hailing app, which I am not going to mention by name in protest at the persistently atrocious behaviour of the hooligans employed by their food delivery arm, and if that doesn't show them, I don't know what will. Their new thing is an offshoot called Bubbles, which will cater to visitors to Paris. For a flat fee of €200 for up to 4 passengers, they will collect you at 10 o'clock in the morning and cart you off on a day trip around various producers of that fizzy wine that France won't let anyone else call champagne. David, would you be tempted by this?
I would be tempted just to see if this is a real thing or not. I wasn't sure if I'm out of touch or if this is some kind of elaborate joke by the champagne manufacturers.
I think it's a real thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be it's the wrong date for an April Fool's prank, and it would be a weirdly obtuse one if it was. So I think it's a real thing. So if we assume that this is a real thing,
I'd be curious, and I like the idea of accidentally ending up in a car with some very confused Olympic tourists who ordered the wrong kind of car, maybe. It's intriguing. Uber does this. Oh, I've said their name.
Okay, cat's out of the bag now. I'm sure none of our listeners could have figured it out for themselves. Nadine, I will grudgingly suggest, though, that if there are 4 of you and lunch is included, it's not bad value, really, €200. And, we are speaking in London, where I can tell you from very recent experience, it is perfectly possible to go out and have an extremely modest meal and a couple of drinks and run up a bill clearing 3 figures for 2 people.
Yeah, I mean, London prices are crazy. There's the pub outside Westminster. I've not checked this myself, but apparently a G&T there is now £18, which is insane. Like, genuinely insanity. So that costs
£18 for a G&T.
£18
I would want that pub to bring me the G&T here for £18.
Yeah, it's shocking. So no, £200 for 4 people to drive around, trying champagne in Paris. I mean, if you're a tourist, it probably appeals to you. For me,
lunch included.
Lunch included. So it's a good day out. It's probably good value for money. Paris isn't cheap. France isn't necessarily cheap. So no, it's not bad pricing. But for me, it's just not my kind of thing, I don't think. Well,
we do want to move that on, Nadine, and I will ask you first what your kind of thing is, because we did want to ask you, are there just shamelessly corny tourist trap type experiences you will admit to having quite enjoyed? I'm going to go ahead and establish a marker here. The Postal Museum here in London is actually really interesting, genuinely really interesting, because they've got the attitude absolutely right. There's this whole pervasive thing of we're the kind of massive nerds who've done a whole museum about the postal service, live with it. But they still have operating the little railway that used to run under part of London to move the mail around London. So you can actually get on the little train and drive through the little tunnels.
That sounds cool, to be fair.
It actually is really cool.
Yeah.
So
you've sold it to me.
Okay. Well, I'm not on a commission. But is there a corny tourist experience you have genuinely enjoyed?
I love watching the jousting. It's fake jousting, obviously, but
where do you go to watch fake jousting?
So I obviously grew up in the West Midlands, and there's lots of reenactments, that sort of stuff. Warwick Castle does them, and they'll have people that pretend to joust, and I love it. It's like I'm in Game of Thrones or something. I love it.
That actually does sound genuinely excellent. Do people
people give favours on the give the people on the horses favours, and everyone's cheering, and there's all the kind of heraldry and the and all that.
But do you actually get to see somebody all dressed up in armour getting clouted off their horse?
Yeah, they fall off. I mean, it's staged. It's a staged fall,
nonetheless.
Because obviously back in the day when they actually did used to joust, the joust could snap, and then wood could end up in some orifices or not orifices in necks and things like that. But that doesn't happen these days. It just tends to I think it's pre-broken, so they'll charge at each other and hit the shield, and then it'll kind of break, but it's pre-broken, no one gets hurt, the horses are all fine. It's just a great day out.
That sounds genuinely outstanding. David, can you beat that?
I can't beat that. I used to love seeing the, the big yellow duck buses driving around, but didn't they keep catching on fire or something?
Well, it's just,
did you like watching them burn?
No, I can't comment on that due to various legal considerations.
Just enjoy watching a blazing tourist bus.
A real Londoner there.
Yeah. Well, on that upbeat and hospitable note, David Brennan and Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our weekly letter from is a letter from me, from Djibouti. To be clear, I am no longer in Djibouti, which, for reasons shortly to become apparent, is something of a relief all round. From go to woe, and including a lengthy stopover in Istanbul, flying from London to Djibouti takes about 14 hours. By incredible, if somewhat frustrating coincidence, that's also how long it took for this correspondent, on a recent visit, to get from passport control to the airport exit. To be clear, I didn't get lost or anything. I mean, Djibouti's is a pretty small airport. What I got was enmeshed in a bureaucratic snarl-up far, far too tedious to relate the details of. As a consequence, me and the photographer with whom I was travelling were obliged to spend our first night in Djibouti not in the pleasant hotel which I had been anticipating by the time we landed with a fervour verging on hallucination, but on the plastic benches of the transit lounge. Neither these, nor the fluorescent lighting, nor the air conditioning which hummed at a volume sufficient to occlude incoming aircraft, nor the rattle and squelch of the cleaning staff going about their work, nor the mosquitoes were conducive to a restorative night's sleep. It is always a strange moment when you are told upon reaching an unfamiliar frontier that some or other paperwork is out of order. It happens to journalists pretty frequently. The mood of the encounter needs to be gauged carefully. Misjudgment can mean a regrettable escalation. You might be dealing with a petty job's worth gleefully flexing the little power they possess, and who might be eager to flex it all the way to the lockup.
Okay.
You may be in the early stages of being shaken down by a bribe-seeking grifter, which is a whole other etiquette minefield, as all such flim-flam men prefer to maintain a pretence of propriety, and are prone to theatrical outrage if you are that little bit too artless in your inquiries about expediting fees, administrative charges, miscellaneous emoluments, or tickets to the policeman's ball. And you may be confronted by a combination of both petty apparatchik and bent gouger, at which thought the memory recurs of the Saddam Hussein-era Iraqi customs official at the Jordanian border checkpoint, wielding a syringe and threatening a mandatory HIV test, an unsubtle but effective technique. If memory serves, $100 got his needle sheathed and our vehicle bound for Baghdad, and at considerable speed, lest he change his mind. But this was not like that. The Djibouti airport cops really couldn't have been nicer, nor more sympathetic. It was what it was. What are you going to do? And at nearly midnight there wasn't much they could offer by way of help, though they did make a couple of calls on our behalf, which was probably more than they really had to. Their amiability made it easy to observe the golden rule of all such interactions, i.e. be affable to the verge of appearing actually demented. Introduce yourself to everyone and learn their names and their ranks where applicable. Offer profuse thanks for the merest courtesy or concession. After an amount of circular badinage about the unfortunateness of the situation, and when it became clear there was going to be no escape tonight, the police permitted me to retrieve my checked baggage from the long stationary carousel, although initially suggested it would have to be left in the reclaim area while I went back upstairs. "Come on," I said. "It's got my books and toothpaste and whatnot in it." The officer shrugged and motioned that I should take it. Small victories. They got us some water and left us to it. We made some calls, sent some messages, eventually resigned ourselves to our predicament, made some of the petty decisions of confinement, like whether this bench here is marginally quieter and less floodlit than that bench there, whether one's mosquito net is more usefully deployed in the intended fashion or balled up as a pillow. One tries amid such mishap to be philosophical, admitting to oneself that nobody really aspires to be any sort of foreign correspondent unless there is some fundamental part of themselves that at some level wants, at least once in their lives, to spend the night in an obscure East African airport. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller. Memories. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Nadine, Batchelor-Hunt and David Brennan. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermack and researched by Gunnar Gronlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.